It all started about 5 weeks ago. At first, I dismissed the changes in my wife, Simone, as a phase. We'd been married for years, and I'd seen her go through rough patches before. But this time felt different. There was an edge to her distance that hadn't been there in the past. She began avoiding me, sidestepping any kind of affection, even recoiling when I tried to hold her hand or give her a hug. It was subtle at first, but each time felt like a knife in the back. One night, while I was working late, I caught her on her phone, laughing quietly to herself, something I hadn't seen her do in months. I asked her what was so funny, but she brushed me off, saying it was just a friend from work. That was when the first real pang of suspicion hit me. We'd always been open with each other, never feeling the need to hide our texts or conversations. But here she was, acting like I was intruding by even asking. Days turned into weeks, and her behavior only grew colder. She started spending longer hours away from home, citing late meetings or needing time for herself. When I'd press her about her whereabouts, she'd snap, accusing me of being controlling and paranoid. The coldness between us became unbearable, and with it, a sense of dread I couldn't shake. The walls of our marriage, which I'd thought were solid, suddenly felt paper-thin, with secrets lurking just out of reach. By the second week, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I'd been down this road before in a past relationship, although I'd never shared that part of my life with Simone. I'd learned back then that sometimes, when you sense something is wrong, it probably is. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I held back, hoping she'd open up. Instead, she grew more distant, almost as if she were daring me to find out what was really going on. My trust in her was starting to crumble, and I realized I had no choice. If I wanted answers, I would have to find them myself. So, I decided to follow her, hoping I was wrong, that it was all just a misunderstanding. But deep down, I feared the truth would be much harder to face. By the third week, the tension between us was unbearable. Simone's distant behavior had now seeped into every part of our lives. I'd lie awake at night, listening to her shallow breathing beside me, feeling like a stranger in my own bed. The woman I'd shared my life with for years felt unreachable, as if some invisible wall had risen between us. I knew then that I couldn't keep going like this. I had to confront whatever was happening, even if I feared the answer. One afternoon, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I'd never been the type to spy, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion any longer. That day, she mentioned she was heading to lunch with a coworker, but her tone was evasive, her words carefully chosen. I waited until she left, then followed her car at a distance, keeping out of sight. My heart pounded as I stayed a few cars behind, hoping she wouldn't notice me. When she pulled into the parking lot of a rundown motel on the edge of town, my stomach dropped. I parked nearby, close enough to see her get out of her car and make her way to one of the rooms. She glanced around briefly before disappearing behind the door. My worst fears were unfolding before my eyes. I didn't need more proof, but part of me wanted to confront her right then and there. Yet, something held me back. I needed evidence, something concrete to show her if, or when, I finally confronted her. I waited, watching the door, feeling a mix of rage and heartbreak churn inside me. I thought about all the little things she'd been doing, all the excuses, the lies, and realized that each one had been building to this moment. After nearly an hour, she emerged with a man I recognized from her work, a guy from another department who'd been climbing the ladder quickly. I watched as he held her close, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard in months. It was as if she'd completely forgotten about me, about the life we'd built together. I drove home in a daze, my mind reeling. I'd wanted answers, but now that I had them, I wasn't sure what to do. One thing was clear, I couldn't let this betrayal go unaddressed. I had to confront her, but I'd do it on my terms, when I was ready. The life I thought we had was gone, shattered in the span of a single afternoon. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. Every time I closed my eyes, all I saw was Simone with him, smiling, as if our life together had never mattered. The rage simmered inside me, building with every passing hour. I knew I had to confront her, but it couldn't be in our home. I wanted her to feel the shock, the rawness of being caught where she thought she was safe. So, 2 days later, I found myself back at that same rundown motel. I'd waited, watching from my car until she showed up, parking in the same spot she had before. She stepped out, looking around quickly, then walked straight to room 4. I followed her to the door, anger coursing through my veins as I knocked loudly, forcing myself to stay calm as I waited for her to answer. A moment later, the door opened, and there she was, standing in front of me with a look of utter shock on her face. Behind her, the man I'd seen before, the one from her office, stood frozen, his expression somewhere between fear and guilt. "Jonathan, what are you doing here?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I stepped inside, letting the door swing shut behind me. "I think the better question, Simone, is what you're doing here," I replied, my voice steady but filled with barely contained fury. I held up the small camera I'd brought with me and began taking photos, capturing the scene as it was, not giving them a chance to hide or explain. She tried to grab my arm, begging me to stop, her voice breaking with desperation. "Please, Jonathan, this isn't what it looks like, let me explain." I laughed bitterly. "Explain? Explain what, Simone? The fact that you're here, in a cheap motel, with him?" I gestured at her lover, who was now inching toward the door, like he couldn't leave fast enough. Without another word, I turned to the man. "You have 5 seconds to get out before I make you regret every second of this." He didn't hesitate. In a blur, he grabbed his clothes and was out the door, leaving Simone standing alone, trembling as she tried to cover herself. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt an emptiness settle in my chest. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was a stranger now. "You made your choice, Simone. Now you get to live with it." I left the room, leaving her pleas echoing behind me as I walked away, determined to close this chapter for good. After that confrontation at the motel, I drove home in silence, feeling a mix of rage and numbness I couldn't shake. The weight of everything settled heavily on me, like my entire life had shifted overnight. But part of me felt relieved, the truth was out, and there was no more guessing, no more hoping she'd change. It was over. The next morning, I took the first steps to ensure I was moving forward, alone. I called a locksmith and had all the locks on the house changed. I emptied our joint bank accounts, separating what was mine and leaving her share untouched, then cancelled our shared credit cards. The man who came to change the locks didn't ask any questions, but he looked at me with a kind of quiet understanding as he worked. I could see in his eyes that he knew the look of someone who'd been through hell. Once everything was set, I went to see my lawyer. He'd been a close friend since college, and when I walked into his office, I didn't need to say much. He listened without judgment as I explained everything, from Simone's affair to the photos I'd taken at the motel. I told him I was done, that I wanted to serve her with divorce papers as soon as possible. He nodded, already making notes and outlining what would come next. "Jonathan," he said quietly, "this is going to hurt like hell. But you'll come out stronger on the other side." I wanted to believe him, but right then, it felt impossible to imagine a life beyond the pain. Back at home, I packed up Simone's things, boxing up reminders of the life we'd shared, of the years we'd spent together. It was surreal, each item a memory tainted by betrayal, and yet, I felt a strange sense of peace knowing I was taking back control. Later that day, I left her things at her parents' house, telling them that she knew why. I didn't give them details, I didn't need to. As I drove away, I realized that this was just the beginning of the end. I still had mountains of pain to climb over, but at least I was starting the journey. The day after I left her things at her parents' house, my phone rang. Simone's name flashed on the screen, and I ignored it, letting it go to voicemail. She called again. And again. Finally, I picked up, unable to ignore the calls any longer. Her voice was shaky, almost frantic. "Jonathan, please, just give me a chance to explain. I'm so sorry, it wasn't supposed to be like this." I took a breath, fighting back the anger that simmered beneath the surface. "Explain what, Simone? That you chose to throw away everything we had for a fling? That you turned our life into a lie?" My voice sounded distant, even to me, like I was watching someone else have this conversation. "Please, it was a mistake, Jonathan. I was just going through something. I didn't mean for it to happen," she pleaded, her voice breaking. But her words only deepened the hollow feeling in my chest. She hadn't meant for it to happen, but it had. And now we were here. "I'm sorry, Simone. There's nothing left to say. I've already started the divorce process." "It's over," I replied, my voice steady, final. Her sobs filled the silence before I hung up, putting an end to the conversation and any remaining hope she might have had for reconciliation. Later that day, Simone's mother called me. She was clearly distressed, her words stumbling over each other as she asked me what was happening. "Jonathan, I don't understand." Simone came here in tears, saying she's ruined everything. "What's going on?" I hesitated, not wanting to hurt her parents with the truth but knowing I couldn't keep it from them either. "Doris, I'm sorry. You know how much I care about you and Sam, but this is between Simone and me. She betrayed me, and I can't look past it. It's best if we go our separate ways." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end before Doris whispered, "I'm so sorry, Jonathan. I had no idea." I could hear the pain in her voice, and it broke me all over again. They'd been like family to me, supportive and kind through the years, and now they, too, were caught in the aftermath of Simone's choices. When I hung up, I felt drained, as if every ounce of energy had been wrung out of me. I knew this was only the beginning of many difficult conversations, but I also knew I'd taken another step forward, cutting the last threads that had bound me to the life we once shared. Over the next few weeks, word of Simone's affair started spreading. I hadn't spoken a word to anyone outside our families, but news has a way of traveling fast in small circles. Soon, Simone's work knew about her involvement with her coworker, and the scandal hit hard. The man she'd been seeing was married, and his wife was just as blindsided as I had been. She filed a formal complaint with their company's HR, and within days, Simone and her lover were placed on leave pending an investigation. It was a strange feeling, watching the fallout from a distance. I'd never wanted revenge, but seeing the consequences of her actions play out felt oddly satisfying. For so long, I'd blamed myself, wondered if there was something I could have done to prevent this. But now, I saw clearly that this was her mess, her choices coming back to haunt her. Simone tried to reach out, leaving tearful voicemails and sending long messages about how sorry she was, how she'd made a mistake. She begged for forgiveness, claiming she'd do anything to make things right. But there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage, nothing that could erase the image of her with someone else. The more I listened to her apologies, the more they felt empty, like she was sorry she got caught, rather than sorry for what she'd done. One day, I ran into an old friend at a coffee shop. He was someone who knew us both well, and when he asked about Simone, I hesitated, unsure how much to share. But he'd clearly heard bits and pieces already. "I'm sorry, man," he said, his face filled with sympathy. "I had no idea she'd go down that path. You deserved better." Hearing those words from someone else finally started to shift something inside me. For months, I'd felt like maybe I'd failed somehow, that maybe I hadn't been enough. But I realized now that her choices were her own, rooted in her own issues, and I wasn't responsible for the path she'd chosen. Simone's job eventually terminated her contract, citing conduct issues. Her lover faced similar consequences, and the two of them were left to pick up the pieces of the lives they'd both shattered. It was a painful reminder that actions have repercussions, a truth she couldn't escape any more than I could escape the betrayal. In the quiet that followed, I felt a sense of closure. I hadn't asked for this fallout, but it brought a strange sense of justice, as if the universe was helping me find the strength to move forward without looking back. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild, not just my home and routines, but myself. The betrayal had left scars, but time and distance had a way of softening the pain. I kept busy, focusing on work and reconnecting with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my years with Simone. They helped me see that I wasn't alone, and their support became a foundation I leaned on as I found my way forward. I moved to a new apartment, fresh and free from memories, and found comfort in starting over in a space that was entirely mine. My mornings felt different, filled with the peace of solitude rather than the weight of suspicion. Each day, I'd go for a run, something I hadn't done in years, and with every step, I felt a little more like myself. I'd come to realize that life after Simone wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past, but about accepting it and building something better from the ashes. Simone continued reaching out, though her messages had slowed to an occasional email or text, usually expressing remorse or asking for another chance. But I'd made up my mind. Forgiving her didn't mean returning to the life we'd shared, and I'd finally learned to let go of the need to understand her reasons. Her actions, the choices she made, were hers alone, and I was no longer responsible for carrying that weight. One day, my daughter came to visit, sensing the quiet calm that had settled over my life. She sat with me, sharing her own memories, her own heartache from watching our family fall apart. She looked at me with pride and relief, as if finally seeing her father moving forward was a relief she'd been waiting for. We talked for hours, both of us acknowledging the hurt we'd endured, but also the strength we'd found in the process. As the sun set that evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. I knew the journey wasn't over, and there would still be days when memories of the betrayal might surface. But now, I was ready for them. I had built a life on my own terms, a life filled with new beginnings, renewed purpose, and the knowledge that I'd survived the worst. In the end, forgiveness came not from words spoken to Simone, but from a quiet acceptance within myself. I no longer needed to look back, nor to dwell on what might have been. Instead, I looked forward, knowing that this new chapter was mine to write, free of shadows, and filled with hope for whatever lay ahead.